Good day, everybody. I'm delighted to welcome you to the second module of the Social Policy for Development Planners in the context of COVID-19 pandemic course. The module is intended to introduce you to the field of social policy, its meaning, its scope, and some of the debates within the field around the meaning and scope of social policy. We will elaborate on what I call some of the anomalies and the paradoxes in some current discussions or dominant discussions of social policy. And then we will look at the broader understanding and the framing of social policy, especially as it may relate to the African context, especially from the perspective of a broad range of policymakers, policy pioneers of the domain of public policy. The model will emphasize the inherent way in which power is embedded in any social policy framework, and how power relations are the heart of what you call social policy, any social policy framework. We will highlight in particular how social policy design and development are immensely gendered. We will explore what social policy means in the context of COVID-19 pandemic and the implication for the social and health and livelihood costs of the pandemic. We expect that by the end of the module, the participants will have gained a broad and robust insight into the subject matter of social policy and be able to identify the different types of policy instruments that will be involved in social policy, the modes of their mobilization for improving human well-being and for development. We'll play this video as an introduction.
Ask a sort of obvious question: what is social policy?
Conference of the Social Policy Association, because it's a question that's been asked in at least two of the sessions that I've been to. I think a lot of people both studying social policy and seeking to implement social policy, as they were doing social policy in the world, would say that it's about promoting welfare and well-being. It's about how we make the lives of all of the citizens in our country, how we make it possible for them to live safe, fulfilling, healthy lives, how we make it possible for them to achieve what they want to do within their lives. And that's often captured in this notion of welfare and well-being. So what we're studying when we study social policy is we're studying how we deliver welfare and well-being to people. What that turns into in practice actually is a number of different ways in which we conceive of the issue of welfare. What do we mean by it? For example, it presumably includes health. What do we mean by good health? Can we define health? Can we measure health? And then what do we do to try and promote good health? So you end up then moving from the very general notion of what you study to look at particular aspects of policy development and policy delivery. So in a social policy student will study things like the National Health Service, how it's developed, how it's changed, how it operates. They will study education systems, the role of education for school children, and then how education is taken forward into later life, what they call these days lifelong learning. Increasingly important to recognise that education isn't just something that happens to kids at school. They would study how we provide for people's material needs, how we provide for housing, how we provide transport and other environmental factors. and of course in particular how we provide people with the wherewithal to meet their own material needs. In other words, the question of the distribution of resources, particularly cash resources, people's incomes, the social security that can help to support or replace the incomes that they might lose. So we study those different policy areas and how they're implemented and how they've been developed and how they're implemented in practice. And then, of course, when we're studying that, there's often an assumption, I think, particularly when people start out studying social policy, that you're mainly then looking at what the state and the government does. In other words, social policy is about delivering welfare for citizens, and it's the government that does that, and they do it predominantly through the public agencies like the National Health Service. But actually, of course, when you begin to look at how social policy is played out in the world, it's not just what government does that makes us contributes to our welfare. Our welfare is developed and is improved and is enhanced by a range of different agencies, which includes private and commercial agencies, providing, for example, providing us, the people who make the glasses that we wear to help us to see. The different a wide range of voluntary and community agencies who contribute in a number of different areas, including much of the provision of social care for people who can't look after themselves or who need assistance in looking after themselves are provided by voluntary agencies. So it's what we do on a voluntary basis for each other. But also, actually, and probably the most unsung area is what happens informally, in informal relationships between individual citizens. And an awful lot of our welfare we actually do on a more or less face-to-face, certainly person-to-person basis, and of course, in particular, through the family and the importance of the family and different family structures and different family shapes. They're not all the same, but the role of those informal relationships. So it's not just about what happens in the NHS, and indeed it's not just about what people in government and policymakers say. The implementation of social policy covers a wide range of relationships that start perhaps with the formal and governmental, but also include the informal, the family, the community, the voluntary, and so on.
So this interview was at the 2007 Social Policy Association annual conference in the United Kingdom, and Professor Peter Alcock was asked the question, what is social policy? What is important in his response was that social policy is about what he called promoting welfare and well-being. It is about how we make the lives of all the citizens in our country, how we make it possible for them to live safe, fulfilling, healthy lives, how we make it possible for them to achieve what they want to do with their lives. And that is how Suffolk captured is said by the notion of welfare and well-being. He goes on to elaborate within the specific UK case, and it's important to keep that in mind that this is focused on a specific case of the United Kingdom. It throws up the question of the different ways in which welfare and well-being of people is achieved, and the different parts of social policy and so on. In Peter Alcock's conception, therefore, social policy is concerned with promoting welfare and well-being. In what would be considered an expansive framing of social policy, Alcock offered a range of services: health, education, housing, and the ways in which social policy is delivered, social state institution, voluntary organization, but as the family as well. Now, it's important to keep in mind that social policy is the name given to a field of study, not quite a discipline, but a field of study, as well as what the field studies. In other words, the object of attention of the field of social policy is also called social policy. Social policy as a field is concerned with the study of human well-being. And social policy in that context entails the study of the social relations and institutions necessary for human well-being, and the systems by which well-being may be promoted, or for that matter, as Dean Hadley would argue, impaired. Hadley Dean, for instance, will insist that social policy has its focus on people's well-being, and he expressed the preference for well-being rather than welfare, because he argued that well-being is about how well people are, not how well they do. In other words, well-being is about the essence of their lives, much more than welfare about how people are faring. To return to Alcock, the study of social policy he argued, is the study of how we deliver well-being and welfare to people. And it covers issues of healthcare, education, transport, and housing, among other things. It involves what he calls the distribution of resources to ensure income security. In terms of who does it, in terms of who does it, ARCOP, for instance, will suggest that social policy is delivered by government and state institutions, by voluntary agencies, and it mentions informal provisioning by family, etc. However, as we will find out, a significant part of social policy is delivered through private sector or the market. The most significant part of this will be private insurance for healthcare, for old age pension, employment, benefits in terms of health insurance, in terms of subsidy for children's education, in terms of old age pension, and so on and so forth. And several of the mechanisms for ensuring the well-being of people, as we will argue, come as part of an employment package, and so on and so forth. What I will argue is that, in fact, the conventional wisdom in social policy can be a bit more restrictive in terms of the kind of thing we come across regularly than Alcock will argue. In what we refer to as conventional wisdom in social policy, therefore, it is not usual to come across the conception of social policy, as deliberate intervention by the state. It is not unusual to come across the conception of social policy. To give us an example, cited in by John Baldock and colleagues, as a deliberate intervention by the state to redistribute resources among the citizens to achieve a welfare objective. In other words, a welfare system, they argue, is defined as the range of institutions that together determine the welfare of citizens. And it is generally considered as public policy matters that involve deliberate state policy, which would be in the form of direct public or state provision of services or resources, which can be transferred in kind or in cash, or public policy in the form of laws and regulations that define private provision. In terms of the institutional mechanisms for delivering social provision, social services, and so on and so forth, these are generally considered to be either through the state, the market, or the family. Voluntary organizations may be contracted by government to deliver services on its behalf. Baldock, for instance, will argue, and the colleagues, will suggest that the classic examples of social policy are the activities of government in providing money and services to their citizens in 5 main areas: social protection benefits, often known as social security, health services, education services, housing provision and subsidies, and personal social services. And the list of the main areas that Baldock and others highlight tends to privilege what we call social protection in terms of ex-post protection from vulnerability. In other words, a response to vulnerability, often after it has occurred, and in many cases discounting or neglecting education services. Indeed, the OECD experts who compile the statistics on social protection expenditure exclude education because they argue government do not provide education to provide support during circumstances which adversely affect people's welfare, but rather as a form of investment. In these areas, public social spending and private social spending as distinct from exclusive private spending. In other words, you take public spending, you take private spending that is involved in a part of a pool, like private health insurance or what do you call it, private retirement benefits and so on and so forth, as distinct from what you may call exclusively private spending, will be considered what do you call it, social policy. And then you have publicly mandated spending on the provision of healthcare and private expenditure on health insurance, for instance, will be regarded as part of matters of social policy. But out-of-pocket health spending may not. The problem here is, of course, that out-of-pocket spending and its size in healthcare spending is really a function of how health financing is organized within a social policy framework. So co-payment, either in publicly mandated health systems or private insurance, is a result of the decisions on how a health system is to be financed. Similarly, issues ranging from the organization of the labor market, including active labor market policies, in other words, efforts to actively train people in context of what do you call it, retrenchment, reskilling, and finding them employment opportunity, for instance, to public mass transit and transport that will be considered components of social policy. In most framings, are in fact in the classic examples provided by Baldock and others missing. And then, of course, there are issues of what we may call the anomalies and paradoxes, and we're highlighting this because when you come into the literature, read on your own, you're likely to come across a number of these anomalies and what I would refer to as paradoxes, which can create problems in terms of understanding what is the remit of social policy. So that, for instance, despite the general awareness of the diversity of instruments, and we're talking about public policy instruments, education as a policy instrument, healthcare, and so on and so forth, in social policy, and the modalities for its delivery. The field of study has tended to focus, especially in the context of Europe and the OECD countries, for instance, to focus on states or markets as the sources of what they call it, social provisioning. Related to this has been the excessive privileging of income support and income maintenance dimensions of social policy. This tends to overinflate the social protection component of social policy. And it's not unusual for you to have a situation where people talk about social protection as if they mean the whole of social policy, when in fact it deals with the social protection component of social policy. But we'll come to this later. So despite the clear awareness of the broader understanding of social policy by some of the leading experts who work in the area, their work tends towards this direction of overprivileging, the privileging of income maintenance in social policy, with the unintended, and I emphasize unintended, result of narrowing the vision of what social policy is about. An example of this is the bulk of the works around building what we may call typologies or taxonomies, and we'll deal with this in another module, of welfare regimes. Despite the very deep understanding of social policy that one will come across in the works of Costa Espinanderson, for instance, and a remarkable amount of work. The primary component for the cluster analysis from which the welfare state regime typology derived are old age pension, sickness, and unemployment benefit. So despite the immense value of Espin Anderson's work in this area, the social policy instruments used in constructing the typology, different types of, welfare state, regimes, mainly are those concerned with income maintenance or income support, which is a component of social protection task or social policy. You will notice that these are a much smaller array of things than Alcock, Dean, or Baldock and colleagues are highlighted as matters for social policy. For a time, typology building along the lines of Espin Anderson came to dominate the field of social policy with a predominantly similar focus on a limited set of social policy instruments, often mainly social protection types. So even when people are familiar, understand a much broader understanding of social policy, or at least different components of it, when it comes to actual implementation of typology construction, typology building, for instance, they tend to narrow down this thing. We will return to the issue of the typology, for instance, in Module 3. We're emphasizing the anomalies and paradoxes in the conventional orientation towards social policy in the field to alert development planners to the implications for development of social policy architecture within the context of development planning. Some of the discussions you may come across are, arcane, but being aware of them is crucial in orienting you towards what we will call a wider vision of social policy. We're aware that other components of social policy literature that you will come across will take for granted the perspective which we consider anomalous. They'll just, present them as if that's what social policy is. Gustav Espin Anderson's typology of welfare state regimes, for instance, in other words, how the provision of welfare is organized at a macro level, put significant premium on the idea of, say, for instance, decommodification. Again, Espin Anderson argues decommodification refers to when a service is rendered as a matter of right, when a person can maintain livelihood without reliance on the market. And he will argue that this involves emancipating individuals from market dependence, from depending on the market. As I've argued elsewhere, the idea of the decommodification may fail to account for what makes something a commodity, okay? And that reference to that particular work is provided in the reading list. And what really happens at the point at which services are offered without the provider demanding payment. So, for instance, publicly funded healthcare or education. Further, it may not adequately capture the norms that underpin the welfare regime where Gustav Espin Anderson argued that decommodification is at its highest. In other words, the social democratic welfare regime. Again, we'll return to this in Module 3. Now, it's important because this tends to, might create misconceptions. First, the core normative basis for the social democratic regime is the injunction that everyone who can work must work. You will find this also in the works of pronouncements by Julius Nyerere as president of Tanzania, for instance. And this idea that everyone who can work must work is within the framework of the injunction that from each, according to their ability, in contributing towards the resources of society, and to each according to their needs in terms of how the society supports the individuals. But in this particular context, if we come back to the the issue of the social democratic welfare regime, for instance. Full employment is a significant underpinning of this social policy regime. The idea that one can slack off, in other words, avoid engaging in market relations, avoid employment, for instance, which is the core area in which market relation happens with individuals, and seek to benefit from the collective resources provided by society, will be considered an anathema in a social democratic context. This is an important insight to keep in mind when we consider social policy in the context of development. Social expenditure, even public spending, is viewed as a means of social investment rather than merely expenditure side of the budget. Healthcare or education, while money may not exchange hands at the point at which the service is consumed, this does not mean that it is free service. Put differently, there's nothing like free healthcare or free education. Somebody is paying for it. And this brings to the fore what should be a planner's preoccupation, with the financing of social policy. You may finance it through social insurance. Now, a different issue of the anomalies and the paradoxes, the conventional view of social policy is with the idea of social citizenship, which is used to signal that entitlement to services and income support is based on citizenship. Now, you likely will come across a lot of this in much of the OECD literature. This is supposed to be an idea borrowed from T.H. Marshall's view of the historical evolution of forms of citizenship, from civic citizenship, civic to political to social. And then as I noted, again elsewhere, Marshall's conception of the social phase in the evolution of citizenship was not about the different types of citizenship. In other words, it's not a different types of citizenship from that grounded in civic and political rights. The stage of the development of citizenship in which social rights become widespread was not about a different type of citizenship. The core value that Marshall proposed is the deepening quality of citizenship. Now, I need to emphasize that the quality of citizenship becomes deeper with the extension of social rights, not just civil, not just political rights. Significantly, access to social policy entitlement may vary, but there is hardly any country where access to entitlement is restricted only to citizens. And this is important because the notion of social citizenship tends to attach social rights to citizens. Citizenship is only part of the story in terms of the social policy coverage. In other words, those who have access to social services, benefits, and so on and so forth. Non-citizens, for instance, with permanent and temporary rights of residence or rights to work, refugees, and so on and so forth, are typically granted some form of entitlement to social provisioning. Again, this is something that planners have to keep in mind. And this is the reason why I'm, highlighting these anomalies and the paradox of these anomalies that you're likely to come across, when you read the broad literature on social policy. And often, and this becomes clearer later, the tendency within the field of social policy and for social policy activists to insist on the sanctity of normative justification of social policy. In other words, you value social policy because it's based on norms of social justice and purely anything that has to do with social policy cannot, stray away from the value of social justice. And then to condemn an idea of a social policy instrument as a means to an end. In other words, what people will call instrumentalizing social policy. In other words, this social policy is introduced, this particular instrument is introduced because it produces something else. In other words, social policy should be valued, they would argue, purely for the norms of social justice that underpin it, rather than the idea that social policy instruments can be used to support other socio-economic projects or objectives. This is something of a paradox in that even the norms of social justice that may underpin social policy are not an end in themselves. They're a means to another objective. And that objective is about improving and enhancing people's well-being. It's about giving people the capacity to live a dignified life. The argument that normative justification for social policy occupies a separate domain of value, separate from what they will call instrumentalizing social policy, would be simply absurd in many cases. The normative underpinning of offering people adult literacy, maybe to enhance the quality of their participation in private and public life. If you can read and write, you do not need someone in the village to read to you the letters that your children in the city send to you, or be privy to your private thoughts in writing your letters to your children. But literacy is an end to other things. Most progressive social policy architecture around social policy in the humane norms of, in humane norms, attend, are concerned with achieving different ends. Again, it is important in the framing of social policy in the context of development. The example of adult education is prevalent in many post-colonial African contexts, and the question of education, for instance, becomes quite important. Education improves the quality of life of people, but you also, education is also an investment in building human resource capacity that you require for for development purposes. Number of engineers, number of nurses, number of doctors, number of school teachers, and so on and so forth. Conventional perspective of social policy can also easily miss the point that employment and decent work, for instance, is a primary enabler of social policy. It's a primary enabler of individual and societal welfare and well-being. It is easy to ignore the fact that full employment or efforts towards it was the primary pillar of Second World War so-called welfare states design.